Hello, my name is Kate Carlson. Today I'll be talking about some work that I have in progress on integrating visualizations of spatial and temporal uncertainty. Uncertainty is an inherent part of research, and there are many different types and sources of it. So some examples are having an uncalibrated machine when you're collecting your data, or maybe the classification system you're using has some kind of overlap or fuzziness. And there are many different dimensions and ways of thinking about uncertainty, and it can have a huge impact on the validity of your work and analysis. And that is why quantifying and communicating that uncertainty is really important to establish reliability and confidence within your work. So as I said, uncertainty is really broad and can be broken down in many ways. So we decided to look at wetlands as a case study and to focus on the quantification and visualization of spatial and temporal uncertainty within wetlands. So wetlands are defined as areas where the ground is saturated with water for varying periods of the year, and this definition includes marshes, swamps, bogs, and fens. And wetlands are extremely important because they provide a variety of ecosystem services such as water purification, flood control, carbon storage, and they're the habitat for a wide variety of plants and animals. Wetlands are classified in a variety of ways. One common method is the cowarding system, which is used by the National Wetlands Inventory, also called the NWI, which is the largest database of wetlands in the United States. The image on the top right here shows what that NWI data looks like. So the cowarding system is broken into five main systems: the marine, estuarine, riverine, lacustrine, and palustrine. And so this is a breakdown, this chart shows a breakdown of, in this case, the lacustrine system. And as you can see, it divides the system into different subsystems, classes, and subclasses. And this classification method is mainly based on landform, soils, and vegetation. Another common classification method is the hydrogeomorphic, or HGM. And it's broken down into 7 main systems, and they are depression, tidal fringe, lacustrine fringe, slope, mineral soil flats, organic soil flats, and riverine. And the HGM is based mainly on landscape and topography, water source, soils, and water flow. So in this example, in this image, we see different examples of water sources. So whether it be from precipitation, from flow from groundwater, or from some sort of nearby surface water that it flows over into. And the HGM, because it takes into account more of these landscape and topography aspects, it can be used to assess how well wetlands are performing their ecological functions, such as water purification or water storage. And this is slightly different than the cowarding, which doesn't take into account as many of these topographical geomorphic aspects. So after picking wetlands as a case study, we had to ask ourselves what types of uncertainty exist within wetlands, and how does one go about quantifying and visualizing that uncertainty. And so the work I will present today focuses mainly on attribute uncertainty, and it looks at how wetlands are classified, and specifically the cowarding and the HGM systems. And so we went about visualizing attribute uncertainty spatially at both a coarse and a fine resolution. The study area we chose is in Louisiana and covers about 2,000 square miles. You can see it outlined here in red. The study area includes part of Lake Maurepas, the Mississippi River, and as well as Baton Rouge. We also chose 2 subsect study areas. So the first one outlined here in blue is over an oxbow lake called False River and includes part of the Mississippi as well. And this area has a lot of agriculture, as you can see. The second subsect study area is over Denham Springs, and it shows a more urban-rural interface. Here's a list of the data sources that we used for this project. So we have elevation, hydric soils, and hydrography, all of which we used to create the HGM and the NWI wetlands to compare it against. So we want to compare the HGM to the Cowardine classification system, which from now on I'll refer to as the NWI for brevity, as that is the source of our data. So according to the NWI, the study area only includes 3 of the 5 Cowardine classifications, and they are riverine, palustrine, and lacustrine. And while the HGM has a riverine and lacustrine class, it does not have a palustrine. So we had to modify the HGM and combine some of its other classes, including slope, depression, and flats, into a general palustrine class. And so we did this so that they were comparable. So this is a very general model of what that process looked like to create the HGM. So we took our soil data, and we took any soil that was had a rating of either hydric, predominantly hydric, or partially hydric, and we created a hydric soil mask. We then took our rivers and lakes features, we created a 90-meter buffer around them, and we combined them with our hydric soil mask. So we only got areas that were within 90 meters of either a river or lake and that had a hydric soil rating, and those became our lacustrine and riverine classes. To create our palustrine class, we took the DEM and we found slope greater than 2% and combined it with the hydric soil mask, and we also found topographic depressions and combined them with our hydric soil mask, and that they became part of the palustrine system. We also took hydric soils, so those rated only the most completely hydric, and those became part of the palustrine system as well. So after creating the HGM, we compared it to the NWI data and used confusion matrices to visualize them. So the first one is showing a confusion matrix for a very coarse attribute resolution. So it's only binary of wetland versus not wetland. So in these confusion matrices, NWI is considered validation and HGM is considered the test data. So true negatives are then areas where both the NWI and the HGM agree that there are no wetlands. False negatives are areas where the NWI says there are wetlands, but the HGM says there are no wetlands. False positives are areas where the NWI says there are no wetlands, but the HGM says there are wetlands. And true positives are areas where both the NWI and the HGM agree that there are wetlands. So the second confusion matrix we used visualizes not only the coarse attribute, but also the fine attribute resolution. So it breaks down not only just the binary wetland versus non-wetland, but it also gets into specific classifications of each wetland type. So this is just a general example of of what I'll be showing you. So in this case, the white areas are the true negatives, so areas where both the HGM and the NWI agree there are no wetlands. Along the diagonal are the true positives, so areas where very coarsely that there are wetlands, and then there's the agreement specifically on what classification. The first column here are showing the false negatives, and these are areas where the NWI is saying that there are wetlands, but the HGM is saying there are no wetlands. And again, this top row is showing false positives, so areas where the NWI is saying that there are no wetlands, but the HGM is classifying them and says there are wetlands there. So the other areas that are shown here in gray are areas of misclassification. So there's a general agreement that they are wetlands, but there's a disagreement on what specific type of wetland they are. So the cells are each color-coded, as you can see. So riverine is shown in blues, lacustrine is shown in purples, and palustrine is shown in greens, and saturation and value are used to distinguish between the false negatives, false positives, and the true negatives and true positives. The first surface that we have shows the binary confusion matrix. And as you can see, so 64.7% of the study area are true negatives, so areas where the NWI and the HGM agree that there are no wetlands. 15% are true positives, shown in green. And these are areas where the HGM and the NWI both say that wetlands do exist here. 14.3% shown in blue are false negatives, and so these are areas where the NWI says wetlands exist and the HGM says wetlands do not exist, and only 6% are false positives shown in red, and these are areas where the NWI says there are no wetlands and the HGM says there are wetlands. So this is another surface of the entire study area, and this time showing the confusion matrix with all of the different classification breakdown at a finer attribute resolution. And so you can immediately see right off the bat that palustrin wetlands dominate the study area, and you can tell this very easily by the color. So you can see a lot more green than any other color. And this is also very apparent in the numbers. So obviously the vast majority of the study area, there's an agreement that there's no wetlands, then that covers 64.7% of the study area. The second and third most highest numbers are to do with palustrin, however. So 13.6% of the study area are false negative palustrin, where the NWI says there were palustrin there, but the HGM did not pick it up. The third highest number is the false or the true positives, so areas where both the HGM and the NWI agreed that palustrin wetlands exist there, and that's 10.9% of the study area. So the riverine and the lacustrine are not as apparent, but you can still see areas where there seems to be a lot more lakes, and you can obviously tell riverine by looking at water features here, but they take up much less of the study area. Something else to note that you see is a high amount of misclassification when it comes to riverine palustrin wetlands being classed as riverine in the HGM. So this surface shows one of the subsets of the study area over Dunham Springs. And again, we see that palustrin really kind of dominates, with 10.3% of this area being false negatives and 2.5% being true positives for palustrin, as well as even 6.2% being false positives. And we see some really interesting features, including a man-made lake that was included in NWI as a wetland, but not in the HGM. And this region kind of highlights some of the potential issues in that we see a lot of these false negatives not being accounted for in the HGM, and as well as a lot of false positives. And potentially some of the causes of that are discrepancies within the data, or how the model was built, or just changes over time, as the NWI was collected much earlier than the HGM data. We also see a large number of misclassifications. So 2.5% of palustrin wetlands were classed as riverine. And this is likely due to the buffer size being too large for this particular river. And so adjusting the buffer zone would definitely help with this, or taking multiple sized buffers would help improve this model. So this surface shows the confusion matrix for the subset of the study area over the Oxbow Lake. So because open water isn't included in the classification, we can really clearly see the Mississippi River outlined here, but the Oxbow Lake is right within this area. And again, palustrin really dominates this area. As you can see, 13.5% of this area is false negatives, whereas 7.75% of this area are true positives within the palustrin classification. And it's really interesting to see this these false negatives here, because it potentially points to something very, very intriguing. So as I said earlier, a lot of the area around the Oxbow Lake is agricultural, And the NWI data was collected in the 70s and 80s within this area, while the HGM is based on more modern data. So a possible explanation for the discrepancy between these two systems is some sort of temporal uncertainty, in that potentially when this data was collected, these were wetlands here, and agriculture or urbanization took over the wetlands, and they are no longer considered wetlands within the HGM classification. And because of the difference between the data collection years, we may potentially be seeing this. So that is a really good transition into future work. So as I said, this is still work in progress, and we're looking to really delve deeper into that temporal dimension, which that last surface I think really shows. We're also looking at additional study areas, specifically in Oregon, and this will help us look at what the visualizations and confusion matrices look like in a different region. There's also a desire to create a software to either automate or semi-automate the confusion matrices and visualizations, and this would be very beneficial to land managers, for example, as the visual display of uncertainty can help focus work in specific areas of high uncertainty, and the percentages of misclassification can help them quantify the degree to which attention is warranted. And wetlands are just one case study, but this process could be applied to other classifications such as land use or land cover, and even beyond. There's also, we are going to look at additional uncertainty metrics such as vulnerability. So in this case, vulnerability refers to fragmentation and destruction of wetlands, and we're very interested to see what sort of spatial and temporal analysis we could do on vulnerability and see if actually these two types of uncertainty interact in any way. Because again, that last surface pointed out, a possible explanation for classification differences over time could be fragmentation and destruction of wetlands. So I'd like to thank you for listening in, and I'd like to thank the GIS and the Rockies Scholarship Board, and I will open it up to any questions.